Hi there, my name is Sam McNeil and I'm the Director of ICT at St Andrews College. I recently had the opportunity to attend the Association of Independent Schools of New South Wales annual ICT Managers Conference in Canberra, Australia. And whilst there, Dave Nielsen from my team and I presented on the power of data, which is essentially the journey over the last 12 months we have taken towards using Microsoft Power BI. So this presentation will quickly whiz through that and highlight the direction that we've gone in. You can download a copy of this presentation from the bit.ly link there if you wish to, and find out some more stories about how we're using data to improve learning outcomes on the blog link there. So a little bit of background of St Andrews College, nearly 100 years old, an independent Presbyterian school with around 1,450 students, around 150 boarders. This is a makeup of the ICT team that has kind of grown over the last 5 years, and importantly we've added a new role this year of a BI report writer. Largely we are a Windows shop and running virtualized Hyper-V across HP hardware. We're running SQL 2014 and also Enterprise SQL for our data warehouse. And we use Synergetic for our student information system, which has a SQL backend. Almost all of the data that we're pulling through into Power BI is coming from Synergetic or our on-prem SharePoint. So a bit of the background in terms of some of our previous data reporting that eventually led us to where we are now with Power BI. Quite a bit of crystal report writing. Here's a snapshot that we had built that would allow us to put in some key metrics of students. Here's another one that we developed last year, which was around reporting on fortnightly notes. And so every 2 weeks, the teachers of the main subjects would put in a grade of 1 to 5 that reflected a student's effort and attitude, as you can see there, 1 being a cause for concern and 5 being excellent. Initially developed in Crystal, but that's pretty clunky. We did then integrate it into our Moodle installation, which is also on-prem, and when a student logs into their Moodle course, they will see a line graph of their fortnightly note scores sort of trending over time and a pie chart of their class attendance for that subject. So this is a good visual cue for them about both their attendance and their attitude and effort in each class. It was actually through this line graph that we started to get the idea of maybe visualizing some of this data beyond just numbers in rows and columns. We'd also done quite a bit of extensive work with using Microsoft Query and pivot table analysis. So this is the same sort of data set as before, again tracking fortnightly note scores, where this time a tutor or a dean could use a pivot table analysis with slices to pull out information. These are really good and powerful, but they tended to be a bit difficult for some of our staff to use. They had to refresh the query and get the new data, and when we added new features, we had real issues with version controls. You can see that one there is version 6. Some were still using older versions and it was a real pain. But pushing a slicer button and getting different results was a pretty effective way of initially giving a little bit of a hint towards self-service BI for our staff. We also experimented with Power Pivot. Here's a basic analysis of the gender breakdown by postal code of students at our school in the South Island. And the bigger the pie chart, the more people coming from those regions, and also the colours represent the gender from each area. Journeyed around Tableau. Again, Tableau's great, it's fantastic, just expensive to scale across all of our staff. There's some academic reporting. So in terms of our journey, we tried to identify some of the pros and cons of each one. Really with Crystal Reports, the only pro was that staff were reasonably familiar with them, and the information was kind of read-only. There was no opportunity to damage it. The pivot table analysis, really liked the flexibility in terms of combining different data sets, and as I said before, it hints at self-service BI. Tableau is excellent. It really is quick to develop with, and there are some built-in self-contained packages that are both interactive and contains all your data for your analysis that can then be distributed to those that need it. The cons, of course, well, Crystal reports we weren't that enamoured with. We didn't have a lot of in-house skills for modifying. It's very static data. It was only available primarily on-site and using Synergetic for Windows, and they weren't particularly engaging. With the query and pivots, I mentioned before, versioning was a big issue, how to make sure staff were only ever using the latest version, and the staff were forgetting to refresh the data set, and we did have limited visualizations there. Really, the only downside with Tableau was cost. To scale that widely was going to be pretty hard. So we reached a bit of a crossroads. Really, Crystal reporting we weren't happy with the appointment of a new assistant principal who had some responsibilities for data collection. We decided to have a greenfield rethink about what we could do if we weren't bound by Crystal and Synergetic reporting. And really, we identified that we wanted something that we could scale across our organisation, both in terms of ease of access, but also that was financially viable. And ideally, we wanted something through a web browser because we figured that was the best way that staff would try and access this data regularly. And hence we discovered PowerBI.com at that time. So in late 2015, we started doing, I guess, what we now call as our first deployment method. And this was a lot of experimentation using the Power BI desktop client, which is free. We attended a Ray Fleming webinar and started to see for the first time some of the power of this. It was really cool. What he essentially did was connected with a Wikipedia page that had some data on there and was able to pull that in and then start mixing it up. And we also built some custom SQL user views to extract data from Synergetic into the Power BI desktop, create some visualizations, save it as a PBIX file, and then manually publish to PowerBI.com. So this was a really quick way for us to build some pretty cool stuff, and particularly using a lot of logic in the SQL user views, we were able to create some really robust NCA reporting. So if you haven't used Power BI desktop, then there's a screenshot that shows some of the mapping of tables. This does look a bit similar to what we end up doing in the ETL process with our deployment method number 2. This is easy to use, whilst it can look a bit intimidating. The desktop client tends to do a lot of the smarts for you automatically and does allow even people with limited understanding of the data to create some connections and then start building visualizations. For those that are more familiar with programming, then DAX is something that you can use as well directly within the Power BI desktop app, which is pretty powerful because it allows you to build measures directly in. And so there's some examples here that in this example we needed students to have 5 credits. This student has 4, but we could actually build in that measure of 5 here and here to kind of create those types of visualizations, which is pretty cool. In terms of the security, essentially all of the data was being stored in Azure in the cloud, and it was being stored unencrypted in the Azure blob. Now, that caused me some concerns, but the reality is that Microsoft's data model is very secure. So essentially you'd access PowerBI.com through your browser, come through the management gateway, and then you would start having the data presented to you through the browser directly from the Azure blob. This did present some interesting questions for us in terms of what data we would or would not want to live in the cloud, and in the end it's become a bit of a moot point because our model has changed. But just be aware, if you do publish directly from Power BI desktop and store all of your content in the cloud, it is generally unencrypted in the Azure blob. So this is just a static screenshot. I point you to the URL at the bottom if you want to see the video of what this actually looks like. I do encourage you to do so. There's about a 10-minute screencast there, and this shows you the sort of reports we were able to make pretty quickly with data, NCA data directly from our student management system, Synergetic. So pros and cons. As I've touched on, in this method, really the speed of development was very rapid. You could build great reports with just probably solid SQL knowledge. Very, very easy to share those reports with other people. It was simply an email invite, they logged in and away they went. And we were getting a lot of initial feedback. The cons, as I touched on, was around security with the data unencrypted. And secondly, the data point here, essentially you could run the risk of people getting access to data through the reporting that they were probably not entitled to, because there was no security layers built into what was being extracted. Whatever permission levels were used to extract the data from your SQL database and publish, within that data would be shared with whoever the report was shared with. So we had some concerns around that, and at this stage we were having to manually refresh the data, which didn't really progress us. We were keen to get an automated data flow that would we didn't have to touch once we'd set it in place. And finally, just given the complexity of some of the building of the SQL user views, it was starting to put a performance hit on our SQL production server. So we reached a bit of a second crossroads. Essentially, we knew that this was a really good solution for us. The proof of concept worked, the data was great, we could verify it, and we were giving our end users some self-service BI in ways that they hadn't previously had access to. But the challenges for us was we needed to make it scalable, which was going to require automatic data flows and very robust security. And we needed to then explore things that we didn't previously have any in-house knowledge with, which was largely ETL workflows, data modeling, and some warehouse concepts. So also in-house we didn't have enough resources to do a rapid development, so we were going to need to get some to plug our gaps and accelerate the development of this. So what did we do? We hired Usha to join our team, who'd had previous experience in the States in this space, and we also partnered with Datacom New Zealand and their BI team up in Auckland, where we had 4 days of consulting in-house, which helped us create initially just a pretty simplistic model that had the full ETL process with output of a very narrow set of data to Power BI, with the idea that we could actually replicate this. Inside of that, we also set up a VM running SQL Enterprise that was going to function as our data warehouse, and you can see the specs on that server there. So now this would be the slide that Dave from my team would normally speak to in the presentation, but essentially what we were able to do very simplistically is we had different data sets. Synergetic remained our primary one, where we would extract data from the back-end SQL database. SharePoint is another one, on-prem SharePoint, also running SQL Standard Edition that we could extract from, but other sources of data as well, potentially Excel spreadsheets, CSVs, anything else really that we could potentially pull in through into our ETL process, which kind of functions on these three things: extraction, where the data is cleansed and profiled; transformation, and then finally it gets loaded into the target, which is a data mart inside our wider data warehouse. So what does this look like in practice? Here we are using Visual Studio 2013 to essentially encode the ETL process, and you can see each of these tasks or like a little job that runs, and inside each one there are subtasks which do this. So here we are extracting the student absence reason from the production database. To narrow down on that, inside that we have essentially the flow here, which says read from the source, which is Synergy 1, DBO, and the table name there. So that is part of the extract process. So if you're familiar with Synergetic, that will make a lot of sense, but really any SQL table is what could be described here. One of the things that we did want to bring into place was more robust security, and so we have implemented what's called row-level security, and this is pretty cool stuff, and that enables us to essentially create a generic report that's provided to all the end users, in our case teachers, but they can only see data that they are entitled to through row-level security. And Dave and Usha and my team were able to build some pretty clever code which allowed us to dynamically keep that row-level security in place in a defined table within the data warehouse, so that it could look at Synergetic, understand the roles of the teachers, what students and what classes they were associated with, and build that row-level security dynamically. This is kind of how it works. Note the reference down the bottom where I've grabbed this image from. Here's the user who in this case is looking to select from patients, but their security policy is hit and they're only entitled to data from level rows 1, 2 and 5, and they have no physical way of seeing 3, 4, 6 or 7. So that's kind of what we're doing. If you imagine a teacher hits the security policy, they teach this class, and this class, and that's the data that would be returned. Here's the security model that we, I guess, now have, in the sense that we're using an on-prem data warehouse rather than storing everything in the Azure blob. Again, found this on the net and referenced accordingly. Essentially, your Power BI tenant sits up in the cloud. You sign in with your school username and password, which comes down from the internet to the on-premise data warehouse using SQL Server Analysis Services Connector. I think it's called the Enterprise Gateway now. And it hits your tabular cube, which in turn pushes off that username and password for authentication through your Active Directory, which returns the user, and that's where your SSAS role is defined before your data is then pushed back to the cloud and displayed accordingly. So we now have no data stored in the cloud at all. All of that is in the on-prem data warehouse. And when your browser session expires, you log out, you close your browser, it's essentially that window into the data is gone, so the security remains there. So we can have a look at a real example. This one here is one that I made for the conference, but probably the better option is to look at the one directly above in this blog post. So in our second deployment method, a lot more pros, I guess, now. The security is really robust. We really like the fact there's defined roles in Synergetic that are dynamically translated into Power BI via the ETL process. The data flow is automatic. We sort of set and forget, and it will just refresh on a nightly basis. We're now in real time pulling through different data sources from both Synergetic and SharePoint. But critically, it's super easy for the end user. They can bookmark a page of the web page of the report and see it at any time. It's really scalable, sort of $3 to $4 per user per month. So across 100 teaching staff, that's pretty affordable. And in the end, if we found a product that was better than Power BI, we could still use the data warehouse for outputting. So that could be to SQL Server reporting services or Tableau again. You're not restricted to just Power BI. The cons, though, I guess, were pretty mindful you need to be aware of. Certainly the cost of development is pretty expensive. Cost of licensing, SQL Enterprise and Power BI Pro all come into play. And for our team at least, there's a pretty steep learning curve of understanding how to do this data modeling and a much more complex environment to actually manage. A few things that would have been nice, what we know now that we wish we knew then, that you can see there. And yeah, I guess if you are wanting to go down the SSAS tabular data model pathway, I wouldn't waste too much time in the Power BI desktop because there's some limitations there. So that's the presentation done in a much shorter time frame than we actually delivered on the day, but hopefully that's of some use to you. I guess the final comment would be if you don't have a lot of in-house resourcing or you don't have a lot of time, stick with deployment method number one. You can create some really cool visuals that you can share pretty quickly and easily without the expense, but there are the downsides of that in terms of some security questions you need to answer for yourself, as well as perhaps the data isn't going to be refreshing in real time. If you do have the in-house resources to kind of go the ETL data warehouse pathway, then you will be very well positioned to build some fantastic reporting for your staff.